learning how to coach is always going to be important, but the reality is the next generation doesn't know their way around technology. I'm sorry, you're going to struggle to survive.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back. My name is James Grigson. Today I'm joined by none other than Sam Robertson. Sam, thanks for joining.
Thanks, James. Nice to talk, albeit from the other side of a screen.
Yes, we're making do with what we've got, mate. I really wanted to go through your journey. It seems that, obviously for those that don't know, Sam is a very well-known figure in the sport analytics, data analytics space within sport, but you haven't always been in that space, Sam. Looking at your journey through golf and AFL and lecturing, your journey started in golf as a strength and conditioning coach. So I'm really interested in the transition from, okay, I want to be a strength and conditioning coach to now I'm really interested in data and I want to take my career in that way. What was the transition like coming in as what appears to be an aspiring S&C coach and then making the switch to more of a data-driven career?
Yeah, you're taking me back a little bit now, back to those days. But I think, strength and conditioning and golf at that point, and probably still not today, weren't really that connected. Although I think it's become a little bit more common with the professionalisation of the sport. But I think a lot of guys who come from either health science or sports science backgrounds start in the gym, and I think it's a really logical place. And it's because it's very accessible to anyone, really. Well, not anyone, but a lot of people have access to a gym, and they're very active before they come into sports science as an interest. So I'd say most people I run into in any walk of sporting vocation have had some aspiration to work in the strength and conditioning space, particularly in Australia and the UK and these areas, less so in America perhaps. So I think that's probably where that stemmed from. As far as golf specifically, that was opportunistic. I think that's often the case. I'd like to say there was a great story behind that, but it was really opportunistic with the program the Australian program relating to golf just happened to be geographically near where I lived, and an opportunity presented itself. So as simple as that. But as far as when I started to shift a little bit, it was, I think when you look back at that, sometimes you can be very strategic on where you're going. And I think there was an element in my journey where I was strategic about that, but my initial shift away from physical training in that area into numbers is probably, it has roots in more the influences that you surround yourselves with. And I think sometimes we don't realize those influences until later on. And so for me, it was probably a realization that there were some hard skills I had in myself around not only mathematics and analysis, but also just that desire to focus more on rigor, and not that that's not in strength and conditioning, but in disciplines that kind of prided themselves more on that. And then also I ran into some people that had influence on my career that had come from that background as well, particularly in biomechanics and mathematics, including particularly my PhD supervisor, which came a bit further down the track, but those people had a big influence on me making that switch.
So you'd gotten into your PhD or completed it in 2011. The switch though, obviously biomechanics, you speak to biomechanics, and I mentioned AFL before kind of being your main sports, at least initially. There's obviously a lot of biomechanics being done in golf, and there's a lot of numbers and heavy data analytics being done in AFL, and that was really starting at that time. You'd mentioned opportunistic and the people that you're around. That really seems to be what triggered your switch from my perspective, just looking at the rundown of your history. It was, you happened to be in sports that were very either biomechanically minded or very data analytics driven. Was there any particular moment that you went, actually, I'm really going to have a red hot crack here and get into this data piece?
Yeah, that's a good point, what you raised there. That's definitely the case. Some sports are more amenable to it, I think. And I think all sports are, but golf is one that's extremely complex. It's a complex movement. There's a lot of information you can collect on people very quickly and very easily, particularly now, more so than it was when I was doing my PhD even. So I think that's definitely fair, what you're saying. And again, biomechanics is a discipline which, when done properly, is one of the more technical of all the sports science disciplines, I think. I know some physiologists might disagree with me, but I think that's definitely true. So the moment, the pivot, I suppose, was, and it's a bit of a perfect storm, like it always is with these things. The pivot for me was, I was interested in working in the performance side of golf, but I was initially starting to do something very lab-based and biomechanical in my PhD. I had a supervisor with a very strong mathematical background. At the same time, I was hearing and reading about things happening in the US that, around the Moneyball revolution, which, was just didn't exist in Australia at the time. And it was the perfect storm, being there was a gap there. And there was a very conscious decision on my part at that stage to not fundamentally throw out my PhD, but shift it into a space that was a little bit more multidisciplinary at that stage. So sports analytics, as we'd call it now, which really for me at that point was just performance analysis, started to emerge as another element of the PhD rather than just biomechanics. And so it ended up being a little bit of a hybrid piece by the end. But there was a very distinct point in time, probably halfway through the PhD, where that happened.
So you would have started, because I see here from your background, you're doing some, obviously within your PhD, you're also doing some lecturing at ECU, but then you still spent some time working as a high performance manager and strength and conditioning coach before moving back from Perth to Victoria. Was that move from Perth to Victoria the point where you went, yeah, I think I need to pivot more and really start going down this track of data analytics and working furthermore with those sports that I'm interested in, but heavily in that data space, and kind of forget the weight room or the typical strength and conditioning modalities of practice?
Well, there's a few things that happen concurrently here. There's obviously the journey you're on with what you're interested in professionally and personally. And I think that's obviously continuous. It's not a discrete thing. I mean, you do wake up, sometimes you wake up one day and want to change what you're doing, but that wasn't the case for me. So, if you look at that journey, and a PhD is a journey, I think you're learning so many things that you never learn as an undergraduate, and that's the way it should be. And that's why I encourage so many people to go and do a PhD in an area for that very reason. It's not just what you come out with it; it's also the things you learn along the way around, research methodology, the design of experiments, ethics, academic rigor, validity. These really important concepts for people working in the field. So at one stage you've got that personal journey going on. Then of course I'm trying to earn a living as well, and while I'm studying. And the reality was at that time there was still opportunities, as there are now, a lot more opportunities in high performance broadly or sports science broadly, as opposed to straight biomechanics. And probably in football codes, which was where I was working, as opposed to golf. There'd be, apart from fitness guys that work directly with players in golf, there'd be, only a handful of really good jobs around the world in that space. So the transition to Melbourne was again opportunistic in the sense that it was a job that had become available in academia, and I'd been through the journey, as you mentioned, that my interest was shifting more to research, or it wasn't even shifting to research, it was shifting more to bigger and tougher problems. And sport has never been a great place to do that in, and it's still not today. In fact, you could argue it's never been further away from that, but maybe we'll talk about that a little bit later on about the influence of COVID on that. But I think the pressure to win and the pressure to compete and have a typical work week where you train and then you compete and then you recover doesn't lend itself well to doing longitudinal research. So that was probably more my interest rather than wanting to go into academia per se. And the job arose in Melbourne, and there was never a driving force for me to come back to Melbourne. It was just, that was an opportunity for me to do something I was more interested in at that point.
Were you always interested in mathematics as a child? Because, for me personally, having been someone who wanted to get into sports science and then wanted to be a strength and conditioning coach, I never necessarily considered myself strong in mathematics, and I can speak for a lot of practically minded S&Cs and think that mathematics is not something that they would necessarily consider themselves strong in. what drove you towards going more down the data analytics route? Was it an interest in mathematics, or, to your point before, an interest in solving bigger problems, and you went, oh shoot, I need to get my head around this maths thing. I don't have a strong base. I need to really rip in here and learn a new skill so I can combat these bigger problems. What was the motivation there?
No, it is probably the latter. I mean, I found an old scrapbook of heaps of stats and numbers from 1993 AFL season the other day in my when I was cleaning out a cupboard. So I've always had an interest in numbers, but probably more numbers than mathematics per se. It was more the bigger problems. And again, as I went on my journey, and that journey is still going now, I probably, and right now I'm in a far better position to speak on it than I was when I was doing my PhD. My frustrations grew around what we weren't spending our time on in sports science. Also probably where the opportunities and the missed opportunities were, and also the level of dogma that was just accepted and a level of current practice that wasn't questioned. And so, yeah, the application of analytics or whatever you want to call it, whatever term you want to use to that is one piece of that one part of that overall viewpoint I have on sport, which is, in some sense disappointing. We aren't making bigger steps on some of those areas, but on the other hand, it also presents a really good opportunity, I think. And I believe that people with mathematical backgrounds will be really crucial in that, but also people that have entrepreneurial mindsets, for example, will be also really, really valuable.
How do you see the entrepreneurial mindset assisting in that space? What do you mean by that comment?
Yeah, I mean, we're probably shifting topic a little bit, but I think we could be specific in a moment about some of the big challenges that sports may be facing and how the next generation can get involved in that. But I think quite simply, the fact is that there's not enough objective questioning going on about the way we run sport from a high performance perspective, or from the way we structure competition, for example, all the way across the pipeline. And I think when I talk about entrepreneurial mindset, I probably mean more disruptors, that people that will disrupt things, but do it in an objective manner. And that's very difficult. I don't know a lot of people like that. I know a lot of people that are happy to come into an area and disrupt it and then leave. And I think those people are valuable sometimes, but they are a dime a dozen as well, in my opinion. And it's not that difficult to do. People that can go and disrupt and then actually provide some logical, feasible, implementable solutions are far more valuable, but also far more rare. So that's why, I think if we come back to where I see sport right now, and I use a word, I don't know if I used the word transdisciplinary earlier, or interdisciplinary earlier, but as there's a number of reasons why a lot of problems that we face in sport are now more solvable than they've ever been before. And that's not just the professionalisation of sport, but also there's more and better data than we've ever had before. There's more graduates coming out of courses as well. So I guess what I mean by that is that the average sports science student coming in now, or staff member, for them to have expertise just in biomechanics or just in one area and not have some ability to navigate technology, some ability to be entrepreneurial, innovative, I don't think they'll survive. And the innovation piece talks to the fact that things are moving so quickly now. And if we bring it all the way back to strength and conditioning, if you're an old school strength coach, learning how to coach is always going to be important. But the reality is the next generation doesn't know their way around technology. I'm sorry, you're going to struggle to survive. And some people see that as a shame, but it's the reality, I think. And so I think you need more than one string to your bow in that respect.
Yeah, I think your point, as you were explaining it, I just kept thinking of the term creative thinkers, and however that person chooses to express that creativity, whether it be through looking at objective numbers to be able to solve a problem, or be able to come into an environment and disrupt what's happening at the moment with some creative observations, I think is incredibly important. Not just to have that capability, or at least try to hone that capability. It's not only important for a sporting organisation, but just broader life, really. When you spoke about before, and I know that this still frustrates you to this day, the fact that there is a focus in areas in sports science and the industry as a whole that there doesn't necessarily need to be, and there's not enough questioning in other areas which are just considered the status quo. What's an example, just out of curiosity, and I don't want to get you on too much of a rant, but what's an example of that you saw back when you initially started this journey around that, 2012, 2010 mark, which hasn't necessarily been addressed and is still something that is not focused or thought enough critically about today?
Yeah, I'm not sure that it's any specific area per se. I mean, I've been vocal in the past around injury and modelling around injury, but I think that's just a proxy for a lot of things that we don't do very well. So fundamentally, I boil it back down to the way that we're training our undergraduate students, and it also maybe has something to say about the demographic that are coming into sport. But the reality is we're not at risk of, not at risk, but at our need and willingness to develop skill sets in all of the sports science disciplines, which are quite broad, let's face it, in our graduates. I feel like we're not embedding other hard scientific skills into their skill set. So these are things like, and I mentioned some of them earlier, some of these things like understanding how to read research and interpret it, and also understand its limitations. Basic concepts of measurement like validity and reliability, understanding what a meaningful difference is. Guys like Stuart Cormack, for example, have been talking about that for 25 years. But the reality is, as a whole, I don't think graduates are coming out with those skill sets well developed. So if we then fundamentally look at the way that professional sports are operating and the people that are in management roles that came through 10, 20 years ago, it shouldn't be surprising to us that they make decisions that aren't evidence-based if they aren't trained well enough in that area. So there's a slide I use a lot when I give presentations, which talks about decision-making as well. And it's probably relevant here, that we have all these different people with skill sets in physiotherapy or sports science or coaching, that a large part of their job is actually decision-making. And the reality is you go through all those courses and there's no element of decision-making in their training whatsoever. Some aren't really exposed to that at any stage until they go into doing an MBA, for example. And it's not inherent in most PhDs either, for that matter. So this is a fundamental problem when most of these jobs have large amounts of data to deal with, and really important decisions to make on fitness and health of athletes, on whether you're going to terminate an athlete's contract or not, how you're going to design a training session for a particular day. This is basically what high performance sport is, and we don't have good training in how to make those decisions.
So when you're talking about, having critical thinking embedded into degrees and having elements like academic rigor and understanding meaningful change, meaningful differences, having those skills more embedded into degrees, are you suggesting that maybe we need to have more multifaceted graduates, or is it a case of potentially even splitting up some of these degrees to have, people that are more practically minded and coach-based, coach-driven, and then the people that are more data-minded and teaching them that they need each other, and you almost create more degrees and more roles? What's your thinking behind that? Do you want to create someone who can do both, or do you think it's actually better separated?
It's a very difficult question for a number of reasons, because we have accrediting bodies in Australia like they do in the UK and well, not so much in the US, but there's accrediting bodies all over the world to deal with. And university systems and accrediting bodies move slowly. They're always going to. And so when I say I'm critical in the way we trained our graduates, I also have some understanding that the world didn't look like it does now 20 years ago. So potentially even some of the things we need to train in graduates now weren't as important then. So, I mean, you've used the term creative thinking. I think it was a common term around computational thinking, which, I think in the US was named as the third pillar of science about 5 years ago, which basically refers to making sense of the world around us based on the way a computer would see a problem. And I think if we think about that deeply, we realize there's so many functions in our day-to-day life are driven now or automated or regulated at least by computers. And so if we can understand the way a computer views a lot of our problems, then we're going to to make sense of it a little bit better. Now, some would call that dehumanizing the process, but the reality is this is where we're at. And in sport, it's no different. If we are going to keep ingesting volumes of data into various problems, as humans, we're limited in our ability to make sense of that data cognitively. We just can't do it. So we either scale it back or we understand how computers make decisions better. And I think some of the best people I know in sport don't actually have training in data analytics per se at all. They are just very good computational thinkers. They can see how these problems can be solved in multidisciplinary teams of people working together through a similar lens. And so coming back to your question, I think I don't have the answer to that. I had a similar conversation with a colleague in the UK not long ago. I don't know whether the answer is to create more general undergraduate degrees, which have then further specializations later on down the track. Part of me says that could work, but then there's also a micro-credential route that universities could go down as well, and in fact other providers outside of universities. So, and the reality is that universities are now, as they've always been particularly for a while, they're more commercially minded than they've ever been, and particularly in Australia because we have such competition in the sporting areas. So you can see that there's competing views there and there's competing interests, and of course this is not a static problem. It's going to continue to evolve. So universities need to make decisions now that are going to impact and be viable in 5 years' time. So I don't think I've answered your question, but I don't know. I don't have the answers, and I normally don't like being critical of an area if I don't have the answer. But I think it's solvable. But I think it's going to require a number of different people to come together to solve it.
No, you certainly brought up fair points, and it's a discussion point that needs to start. You'd spoken about just the issues of trying to implement it, whether it be research or simply just answer questions in a professional sporting environment, and how tough that can be. For somebody who is in a sporting environment at the moment and they're trying to create change, whether within the data culture or the day-to-day, try to bring in a new innovation, trying to do something different, that is trying to come in with academic rigor and try to show that this is going to create change, or at least it needs to be given a shot in a professional environment. For those people, what is the best way to be able to articulate that to the rest of the team? Because I think, that is also one of the considerations to be made as to why changes are hard to make in the professional sporting environment is the fact that you have to communicate this idea to others, which may not necessarily be, those people may not necessarily be a critical thinker or a critical based thinker that you are. They may be more practically minded and just go. So for those people, how do you suggest that they go about trying to create change in their environment and articulate this new change or this new idea to their wider audience and gain attention and hopefully be able to put in that intervention?
It's tricky. It's easier. I'd say it's easier for someone like myself than it is for a 21-year-old guy or girl going to their first job. But which further extends to my first point, which is it's relationships, and that's a soft part of this. As you get to know people in your work environment, you know what makes them tick more. And I think we can't escape that. It'd be nice to say we could go in with a magic visualization and show them how we're going to change the world, but it's relationships. And if you don't have that relationship, you may not even get a meeting, let alone an opportunity to show a visualization about something. And further that, it's perspective, which is, I don't really see as a soft skill, actually. I think it's quite analytical, but we haven't got time to get into that. But and what I mean by perspective is that I think it's having an understanding about the importance of what you're actually trying to change. And that sounds very, very basic and very, very obvious, but it's amazing. And this is a criticism that's been leveraged at sports science disciplines in the past, is that the bang for the buck may not be there with some of the things that it tries to attach itself to. So, for example, why are we? I won't give an example because I don't want to pick on anything unnecessarily, because there's a lot of areas this could extend to. So, I think having that perspective that you're very confident that what you're proposing is going to make a meaningful improvement to the athlete or the team that you're working with, and you don't always know that, but I think you've got to have some idea of that before you you go in. And then you mentioned communication, and that's a key word here. I think you've got to have the ability to communicate that clearly and succinctly. And that sounds kind of obvious as well. But again, this is something that you not only need a strong business case and potentially some strong data behind, but you also need, unfortunately, this is where experience comes into it again a little bit as well. You need you probably need some skin in the game as well in order to get taken seriously. And that's a shame, but that's the human element of this. I've seen some very young, inexperienced people come up with some fantastic proposals that are going to potentially have a fundamental impact on the club or the team they're working with, but they haven't been seen by the relevant stakeholders because they're not valued the way they should be at that stage, or they're seen as too young and experienced. And conversely, I've seen it the other way around, where they've gone in with where a young individual coming into a club for the first time has some very strong ideas on things, and frankly, through a lack of perspective and naivety on their part, it's hurt them in their job in the short term and probably in the long term as well. So, yeah, it's almost like you do need to do your due diligence, I suppose, which I think is good advice in any discipline, that you have a fundamental understanding of where the problem sits in the organisation. Can you actually feasibly make the change? And if you can, is it going to be worthwhile them investing in? So it's almost like a bit of a business case, like, I think, before you do it, which people should be doing anyway, I suppose.
You're quite well known in the industry through some of the work that you've done, and you've done some fantastic work to earn, to your term. You've definitely got skin in the game in terms of how you've affected the industry and some of the work that you've done. But you're also you're not shy in presenting that and publicizing some of the work that you do, and not shy, if I can use the word, self-promoting. And I don't mean that in a bad way, because I think you do it in a fantastic way. Very, very humble in the way that you go about doing it. How important do you think self-promoting yourself in the right way is? And can you take me through your psyche, if you think about it at all, when you are going about self-promotion? And because it is an important part of the industry. If people don't know who you are, how they're supposed to listen to what you have to say. So can you just walk me through that a little bit, and what you internalize when you're thinking about trying to garner some attention for something that you've done?
Yeah, I mean, to an extent, it's strategic, and I have a vague kind of strategy that I follow there. But at the same time, I've made mistakes along the way. Not too many fundamentally large ones, I don't think, which has hurt me. But there's certain things that I delimit, I guess, what I will talk about and what I won't. And I think, hopefully the last 10 minutes or so has illustrated to yourself and the listeners that those areas are very much around ensuring that sports science is viable into the future, and then it's focusing on the big picture questions. Because so anything around that, I'm quite happy to talk about. But I'm not that strategic. Like, I don't think I've posted anything on social media this year, for example. So, if I don't have something to say, I won't say it, I suppose. But also life and work gets in the way. But I think you need to be consistent in what you're saying. I mean, I think there's an element of perspectives from people out there that you need to be quite consistent and regular in your messaging. And I think that's definitely true for some individuals. But for me, I'd rather only speak when there's something really meaningful to say. I don't think like there's an ongoing dialogue I need to have. And there are some big picture things and some fundamental things that I think need to be said on sport now, but I'd rather say them when I have a more complete message to say, if that makes sense, and some data to support things. So that's, and then there's other things as well that I can't say. I'm working with clubs and they're tied up in deals and whatnot. But wherever possible, I'd like to be vocal and ensure that this area is viable moving forward, and that organisations and clubs can't afford not to invest in the area. As simple as that.
And I think you've almost hit the nail on the head as to why you come across quite humble when you say it, because your interest isn't in yourself. Your interest is in the embedment of the game, and that sports science continues to be viable for the industry. So I think that's why you've managed to pull that off, mate. For those that are watching, whether it be a younger sports science graduate or somebody looking at a mid-career shift or pivot like you did into sport and data analytics, would there be any words of advice that you have to say for people that are either going about a switch in their focus within the industry, or somebody who is just starting out?
I mean, we've probably touched on some of them already around the skill sets that we've talked about moving forward, around having perspective and knowing where they sit in the system. But the reality is, and this is extremely cliche, but they need to work. They need to have a good work ethic. And I know that won't resonate with everyone, but I see a lot of students, I see a lot of young people coming through, and I've hired some of them, and some of them are in research that I work with, and PhD students and master's students and cadets and work placement students. And the commonality with the ones that are going to have success in the short and long term is that they work. And I'm not saying they're going out there and doing 80-hour weeks, because I don't subscribe to that being a good model for sport moving forward. I think a lot of sports waste a lot of time on things that don't matter. And I don't think there's any sport in the world that needs to do 80-hour weeks or 60-hour weeks even. But you need to work. You need to put the work in to develop yourself and show your value. And a lot of people who are very talented haven't done that in the past, and it's always a sad story. I think, again, we talked about the answers with the courses and not having all the answers in courses. I think that extends also to the other thing I would say here, which is you have to generalize. You have to be a generalist to an extent. David Epstein's written some really good work on that recently. I can't remember the name of his most recent book, but he's talked about that. Yep, which is a really good example, and it really solidified a lot of things I've been talking about in my probably in presentations I've given over the last 5 years or so, but it was great to read that. But I think it's tricky advice as well, because you do. And that very notion of doing a PhD, for example, is you become a specialist or an expert in an area. So when I say generalize, I'm not sure it's the right word. I think almost it's probably also being versatile, being able to adapt to different situations. When I talk about a strength coach who's wanting to be the best strength coach in the world, do I think they should go and become also a great physiologist? No, but I think they should know their way around technology. I think they should become better communicators as a coach. I think they should have an ability to show perspective about where the gains they make in an athlete sit in the overall performance development of that athlete. And, some listeners might be saying, well, that's what I do anyway. And if that's the case, then great. But I think that's what I'm talking about by a generalist, that you're not so narrow on your focus that you're a one-trick pony.
It's my pleasure to sit down and speak with you, mate. I really appreciate your time. For those listeners that are watching and want to watch more, I just did an interview with Paul Seeley, the head of the AFL National Academies, that head of high performance for the National Academies. That interview is just sitting right there. And if you want to subscribe for more, you can click right there. For Sam Robertson, I'm James Grigson. Thank you for joining.
Thanks, James.